So we're going to talk about promises some more. We're going to talk about promise objects because they're really important. And again, if you're only going to pay attention to one lecture this whole time, make it this one, because this is like the big one. And this is also probably the most widely applicable bit of information that we'll talk about right now too. This is something that is going to be true in, it's going to apply not just to AngularJS, but to other frameworks, to JavaScript in general, to AJAX calls. You have probably seen or used a promise object if you have made a call with AJAX before and maybe did not know what it is. So we're going to dedicate some good time to talking about it, not because it's like super complicated, but it can be a little intimidating at first, and it's important. So to kick it off, we're going to talk about asynchronous calls again. I have no idea why it says a/synchronous calls. Typos. Oh no, because we're talking about both in one slide. Got it. Cool. So, sorry. All right, so we're going to talk about this again because it's important and it's particularly relevant here. Remember that languages that make asynchronous calls wait until that line of code is resolved before they move on to the next call. So this is the most important when you're talking about making an API or a data call. So like a Rails app making an HTTP party. I always want to say HTTP party. So if you're using HTTP party on a Rails app to make it a call to an API to get some information back, that app sort of waits until that return has come, until it's gotten that data back from that API call before it moves on. However, languages that make asynchronous calls, they don't wait until the line of code is resolved before they move on to the next call. So this means that if an asynchronous call language like JavaScript makes a call with AJAX or something similar, it won't wait until it gets a response to that request before it moves on to the line of code. So let's look at this. Let's see why we care. Why is this important? So a common use of API calls, particularly in front-end frameworks, is to get sort of data and assign it to a variable and then show it, right? So a lot of the time we want that code to look something like this. Obviously this is pseudocode, but it's something like var results equals ajax.makeAcall. So Ajax makes a call. We assign the response from that to results, and then we want to for each results we want to do a thing. We want to print a statement out to the log, or we want to display it on a page or something like that. We want to do something with this information. So this code will be on other pages too if you're taking this down in notes as well. But so this works fine with synchronous language, but it doesn't work as well with asynchronous languages. So what does this look like in a synchronous language? So let's remember also before we dive into this that API calls do take time. They don't happen instantaneously. Even very quick calls take time. Let's say that this call in particular takes half a second. So what does this look like in a synchronous language, like if we're doing this in Rails or something? So first we make this call, this ajax.makeAcall thing right here. Then we wait for a response. So we hang out until something comes back. We get that response. We assign that response to this variable results right here. And then we begin our each block with that result. So that's sort of what that looks like, right? That's what you'd expect. Let's see what this line of code would look like in an asynchronous language. So it takes these steps instead. So first it makes an AJAX call, same as what we were expecting before. However, it doesn't wait for a response. It moves on. So then it tries to execute this each block right here, but results is undefined, right? Results isn't anything. It doesn't have this data back yet. So then it throws an error, and then it gets a response. So we don't have this assignment happening because instead of hanging out and waiting for this ajax.makeAcall, which again, pseudocode, that's not what Ajax looks like, but instead of waiting for that bit of code to resolve and then moving on, we move on right away, which in this case causes problems because we're asynchronous. So that's the problem that we are trying to solve, and we solve that problem with a promise object. So what is a promise object? A promise object is a placeholder object for data that you're still waiting to get back. It's pretty common. You use these all the time. And it's just an object that sort of represents that data that you're waiting for. There's also something called the deferred object. It's a placeholder for the results of evaluation with the promise. These are used less commonly, and at the level we're talking about here, the difference is mostly syntax. I just wanted to bring this up so that if you see something about a deferred object in the future, this is what it's referring to. When you get really deep into JavaScript, these are very important distinctions, but for right now, the important part is knowing about the promise object because it's mostly a syntactical difference right now. I just wanted to mention it really quickly. So let's talk more. So promise object, it's this placeholder. And we'll talk more about what that placeholder looks like, but first let's sort of look at why we care and how it solves this problem. So we rewrite this code to work with asynchronous calls. It looks something like this. So we have its pseudocode, we have ajax.makeACall, and then we have this .success. And inside .success, we have a function that's taking some things inside, and then inside here, we do our results equals data, and then we do our call in here.
Sorry, can you go back to that, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't actually mean to move forward there. And it's cut off at the bottom. That's awesome. That's fine. But yeah, so we make our call. We do this .success, which we will talk more about in a minute. We have a function that has some stuff in it, which again we'll get to. And then inside this success block here, we assign the results to equal data, and then we manipulate those results. We do things with that. We're executing that success block. Yes?
Can you skip a slide, please? Like very brief. I just want to write.
Sure. I'm going to switch back real fast. You're welcome. All right. Okay. Nope, we're good.
Can you go back?
One more?
Yeah.
This one. Okay, we'll hang out here for a minute. We'll talk more too about what all of these things mean. I just want to look at that real fast. Yes.
So this looks like the Ajax that we were writing when we were doing Rails projects, like in the JavaScript.
Yep.
Part of it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, because while Rails is synchronous, Ajax and JavaScript are not. So yes, you have used it. Yeah. This should look familiar. We're just going to talk more explicitly about what it is doing and why.
So, do you still use Ajax even on a Angular framework to outside API?
Yep, so Angular utilizes Ajax. And the other libraries inside as well, even if they have a library that does not use Ajax. I believe all of the libraries do use Ajax. I am a junior developer and don't know everything in the world. But even if they don't, it's still JavaScript. And so JavaScript is the part here that is asynchronous. And so you almost certainly, it would absolutely blow my mind to pieces if you did not need to use a promise object, even in a non-Ajax JavaScript API call. I don't think such a thing exists, but, junior developer problems. Okay. All right, so promise object sort of looks like a regular object, except the thing that promise objects have that sort of a regular, like, curly bracket, empty object do not have is states. So promise object has these different states, and there are 3 different states, primary states that they have. And they are called different things depending on what you are looking at. So that is why we have 3 different names in each of these bullet points. They are the same thing, effectively. It's just that different languages or different frameworks sometimes call them a different thing. But there are sort of 3 main promise states. So the first promise state that we have is unfulfilled or waiting. Pending unfulfilled or waiting. So that is true when there hasn't been a response yet. So that's like when you make an API call, before you get anything back from the server, you have just made the call and you're sort of hanging out waiting to get something back. In theory, you could write some code in this state. You don't usually. This is just like a state that it has. This is a language that you use when you're talking about waiting for a response from your API. Is that your promise object is in the pending or unfulfilled or waiting state. The second state, which we just saw before, is fulfilled or resolved or success. This is when you get a response that looks like a successful response according to your code. It's like it gets a 200 response or something like that. So according to the header that you get back, it looks like success. So you can use this state. So when you get this state, you get some parameters back. They happen to be data, status, headers, and config are some of the common ones you see. We're going to hop back real fast to the previous screen. So we can see here what we're actually doing with this line of code where we do .success. Oops. Sorry, clicking when I shouldn't be clicking. You can't actually highlight an image, turns out. So we're creating a promise object here. We'll talk more about that specific part in a minute. And then once it reaches the .success state, then it gets the data back. So this data, status, headers, and config is the response from the API. And then we can do things with this response, with this data, assign it to a variable, and then do something with it. So that state, which is fulfilled, resolved, or success, is the state you are in when you see, when according to the data you get back from the API, it looks like a success. If it's a poorly written API and it's just like, there's nothing here, 200, like it's still going to hit the success block, and hopefully you won't ever have to deal with that. But yeah, so you can then access this information once you have a successful API call. You can use a success state in your object to access that information and do something with it. Yes. Oh, yeah.
Does the ordering of data, status, headers, and config matter?
Yes. Yep, because these are variable names. So what we're doing, it's, let's see, how to describe this. So what happens with this, when you hit the success state, you are given 4 things, right? You are given 4 things or 1 thing. We will talk about that part in a minute. So you get these 4 things back. And what you're doing here is you're saying, like, these are the variables that I'm calling these things. So then later, when I go var results equals data, it knows I'm grabbing data, which is the first thing that this API gave back to me. It's the first thing that this object creates when it hits the success. Yes, so that order is important. Most of the time, unless you are doing some error messaging things, most of the time, particularly as a junior developer, the important thing for you is data. Is that first piece right there. Sometimes if you need to like check the status and give an error message or something, the other parts are important. But for the most part, the important thing for you right here is this data. Okay. And then the third state is rejected, failed, or error. It has a failure response from the API. So like a 404 or something, like a 500. And that is what triggers the rejected or failed or error state, which again are all the same thing. It's just a language issue. Unfortunately, this isn't super standardized. And this also gets this data, status, headers, config back. So you can then look at like the error message. You can see like, oh, 404, and then pass that back. As a junior developer, you'll probably interact with this state less often. But yes, so just to recap, because I know that is many things, and we'll go back and look at some code that uses this again in a minute here. So you have a promise object, which is an object that represents, what if you're like pointing at things, what is happening? Okay. That's cool, I understand. But yeah, so you have a promise object, which is an object that represents data that you're sort of waiting to get back. This object is always in one of 3 states, the sort of pending state, the success state, and the failure state. So it's always in one of those things, and once you hit success or failure, then you can get the information that the API has given back to you and do things with that information in the success block, like we saw previously. You have all almost certainly done this if you've made an AJAX call before. This is the syntax. We're just sort of looking more specifically at this promise, at this object, and what that means. Okay, so there are sort of two main syntaxes that we use with promise objects. There are sort of two main ways to do this. It will vary depending on the language that you're using, which one you use, and the frameworks that you're using, and libraries and all that jazz. But there are sort of two main things to be aware of. Again, this is syntax. This is not like a big comprehension difference. So one looks like this. So we have this AJAX call. I need to stop clicking. I'm sorry. So we have this AJAX.call and then pass in some parameters. And this then creates a promise object when you make it this AJAX call. It creates a promise object. And then off of that object, we chain two blocks. So the first, this .success, is if and when we hit the success state, then we want to execute the stuff in this block right here. So success, we can see it creates a function, so it takes a block as a parameter here, which has these data things that we're getting back. The most important one right here is data. And then it will do some things like assign a variable to the data or something like that. And then off of the same call, off of the same promise object, we chain a second method, which is this .error. So once we hit, if and when we get an error message back, then we enter this block. And again, it takes these parameters, it creates this function, it does some stuff in here. So maybe in here we'd have like an alert, like, oh, there was an error. Couldn't make that object, whatever. Yes, question?
So you don't need to do like an if or anything?
Nope. No, it just knows. Yep, so the promise object, it knows about this method. It has these methods, it has these states. This is essentially kind of like an if. So this right here, this .success, is if success. Then do this right here. And this is what the data is, this is the status. You know, you can access these variables. But yeah, if success, do this. If error, do this .error method. Other questions for this part, this syntax? Okay. There's a second syntax as well, and I apologize for some of the weird formatting. It's lots of code on a small screen, relatively here. Things got scrunchy. So with this one, it's similar but a little bit different. So in here we have var promise equals ajax.call params. So here, again, just like before, we're creating this promise object, but instead of sort of chaining methods off of it when we create it, we assign it to a variable, and then we use this .then function. Again, .then is something that your promise object knows about. And .then is a method that takes two parameters. As you can see, instead of having like closing the parentheses here and then doing a dot, whatever, it takes two functions. The first function, it executes when on a success. So similarly, it's like this .success, this first function. And the second one, it executes on an error. It's a syntax difference here. So there are two main differences here. One is that instead of chaining it off of that initial promise object with the .success and .error, we create the promise object and then we do .then and have this different function here. The second difference is that instead of having that sort of big block of data, status, config, headers, I think those were the ones, I'd have to double check, this only gives you one thing, which is data. And this data contains all of that other stuff. So conventionally you call it data, sometimes people name it like response or something, but it's not uncommon to have like var posts equals data.data. Like you see that sometimes. It's kind of ridiculous, but functionally those two things give you the same result. They are just different syntaxes. So we'll look at the differences between the syntaxes again. So the first one chains us off of the creation and does the .success and .error off of that initial creation. The second syntax creates it and then calls the .then function. The second difference here is that the first syntax returns this object sort of parsed out for you into those 4 different variables, while the second returns a single unparsed chunk of data. In my experience, there isn't really a hard and fast rule for when you use the first syntax versus the second. Typically, you use the first one on sort of easy, short, infrequent calls, right? Like you're doing it every now and then here, like then you do the first one. But you might use the second syntax on more complicated calls. But the result is the same. The reason that we are looking at the two of them is that you'll probably be exposed to both of them, right? Like this is stuff that will come up again. So we'll know that. Yes. I believe you could. Conventionally, you do not. But I don't think there is anything stopping you from doing that. It's just the convention is that if you're using dot then, you assign it to a variable first and then call the variable. But yes, I don't believe there is any reason why you couldn't, or any reason why you couldn't do like variable results equals ajax.call whatever, and then do like results.success or results.error. Like I don't think there is a reason, just conventionally this is what you do, is one of these two syntaxes. So there were a lot of things that just happened, and some of them were complicated and some were less so. So the big takeaway here, because a lot of that was exposure, right? To see this so the next time you see it, it is not surprising. But the takeaways and the things to remember, so promises are important. They're these objects that act as placeholders for this data that you've requested and you haven't yet received. And all promise objects have states, which are pending, success, and error. They may have different names, but those are the three states that they have. And you use that to determine how you want to use and display this data that you receive from an API call. You have done this before. We'll walk through some of this later to actually put this into practice. Cool. What questions do we have about promises? Yes?
Would the data ever be tied to anything outside of the API call, or is it all?
No. Yep, data is always, yeah, you can't use that data outside. It's also important to, so if, let's say the data, I'm going to just scroll back so we can look at that code real fast here. Look at this. Let's say that I'm making an API call to get posts. And let's say I'm working on our app, right? I'm working on our app. I'm creating the index page. And I am creating posts. And as we saw the other day, our post objects, they have tag IDs, but they don't actually have the tag name in them. So I have multiple steps in sort of creating this post, right? If I want to display my post and if I want to show the names of all the tags in my posts, one of the steps is that I have to actually pull in the posts. I have to make a call to get all of the posts so I can read those. And the second step is that I have to make a call to get all of the tags so I can match the IDs up with the names. Does that make, are we on, I can type this out too if it is more helpful for visual people? Yes.
I have my thing as an example.
You have your thing as an example?
The filter project.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Your filter project. Okay. Yeah. What did you want to
The
check?
The promise.
Oh, yeah.
Like maybe it'll be more clear.
Yeah, that's true. We could look at that if you'd like. Camilla worked with some promise objects last week too with her really awesome. She's doing, have you seen the project that she's working on? She's been doing this really ambitious like filtering project. Filtering in things like AngularJS is really cool and easy. Filtering in Rails is a huge pain in the butt. And so she's been working really hard and doing some really cool things to show this. So we'll look at this too. But yeah, so if you are making these sort of two API calls, the second one to get the tags and then parse through it, you have to wait to make sure you have both pieces of information. So we'll actually take a look at that. I'm going to go ahead and close the recording here, and we'll take a look.